Right now, someone in your life might be conditioning your responses without you realizing it. Not through manipulation that you can spot, but through a system that rewires how you think, feel, and react. And here's what should terrify you. By the time you notice it's happening, you're already doing their work for them. And the worst part? You'll defend it while it's happening. The first sign this is happening to you involves how they respond when you do what they want. Sign 1, reward withdrawal. This looks like someone who gives you attention, affection, or approval when you behave the way they want, then becomes cold, distant, or unavailable when you don't. When you agree with them, warmth, engagement, validation. When you disagree, silence, short responses, emotional distance. When you comply, they're present and interested. When you resist, they disappear. You think they're just moody or busy, but here's what's actually happening. They're training you through intermittent reinforcement. Every time you get rewarded for compliance and ignored for independence, your brain learns a pattern. This works because of something psychologists call operant conditioning. Behaviors that get rewarded get repeated. Behaviors that get ignored get extinguished. But you don't realize you're being trained. You just notice that certain behaviors make people happier with you. Here's how this plays out. Emma's partner is affectionate and talkative when she goes along with his plans, but becomes quiet and withdrawn whenever she suggests something different. Emma doesn't consciously notice the pattern, but over time she stops making suggestions. She thinks she's just being considerate, but she's actually been conditioned to avoid behaviors that trigger his withdrawal. You don't notice this while it's happening because the training is gradual. Sign 2, emotional punishment. This is when someone uses emotional reactions, coldness, disappointment, hurt feelings, or anger, to discourage behaviors they don't like. They don't tell you to stop doing something. They just make you feel bad every time you do it. You express an opinion they disagree with. They get quiet and hurt. You spend time with other people. They become distant and moody. You make decisions without consulting them. They act betrayed. This works because humans are wired to avoid causing emotional pain to people they care about. But manipulative people exploit this by making their emotional reactions your responsibility. The psychological mechanism is negative punishment, removing something positive, their good mood, their warmth, to decrease a behavior. But it's disguised as natural emotional responses, so you don't see it as control. Over time, you start avoiding anything that might upset them. Not because they told you to, but because you've been trained to associate your independence with their pain. Here's the pattern. Jake's friend becomes visibly upset whenever Jake makes plans that don't include him. Not angry, just sad and withdrawn. Jake starts feeling guilty about having other friendships. Eventually, he stops making plans without checking with his friend first. He thinks he's being a good friend, but he's actually been emotionally conditioned to prioritize his friend's feelings over his own autonomy. But this next sign is the most insidious because it feels like love. Sign 3, intermittent validation. This is when someone gives you praise, attention, or affection unpredictably. Sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't, and you never know which it will be. One day they tell you you're amazing. The next day they barely acknowledge you. Sometimes they're deeply interested in your life. Other times they seem indifferent. Occasionally they give you exactly the validation you crave. Most of the time, nothing. You think they're just inconsistent, but here's what's actually happening. They're creating an addiction to their approval. This works because of variable ratio reinforcement, the same psychological principle that makes gambling addictive. When rewards come unpredictably, your brain releases more dopamine than if the rewards were consistent. You become hooked on the possibility of getting that validation. The intermittent nature makes their approval more valuable, not less. Because you never know when you'll get it, you start working harder to earn it. You analyze their moods, adjust your behavior, try to figure out what triggers their positive responses. Here's how this looks. Maria's boss sometimes praises her work enthusiastically, calling her brilliant and indispensable. Other times, he barely acknowledges her contributions. Maria finds herself constantly trying to recreate the conditions that led to his praise. She works longer hours, takes on extra projects, and constantly seeks his feedback. She thinks she's being ambitious, but she's actually been conditioned to chase his unpredictable validation. At this point, most people still think this is normal behavior. That's how effective the conditioning is. Sign 4, normalization of disrespect. This is when someone gradually shifts what you consider acceptable treatment, making you tolerate things you never would have accepted before. It starts small. A dismissive comment here, a boundary crossed there. Nothing that seems worth fighting about, but each incident moves the line of what's normal. They interrupt you more often. You stop expecting to finish your sentences. They make decisions without consulting you. You stop expecting to be included. They dismiss your feelings. You stop expecting to be heard. This works through something psychologists call the foot in the door technique, combined with habituation. Small violations of respect become normal, which makes bigger violations seem less shocking. Your tolerance shifts so gradually that you don't notice it happening. What would have outraged you 6 months ago now feels like just another Tuesday. The psychological mechanism is adaptation. Your brain adjusts to new baselines to reduce stress. But manipulative people exploit this by slowly escalating disrespectful behavior until you're tolerating treatment that would have been unthinkable before. Here's the progression. Sarah's roommate starts borrowing her things without asking, just small items. Sarah doesn't want to seem petty, so she doesn't say anything. Gradually, the roommate takes bigger things, uses Sarah's food, brings people over without notice. Each violation is just slightly worse than the last. So Sarah keeps adjusting her expectations downward. A year later, she's living with someone who treats her home like they're a personal property, and she thinks this is normal roommate behavior. This next behavior requires no external control at all. Sign 5, self-censorship training. This is the final stage when you start filtering your own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors automatically without them having to do anything. You catch yourself before you disagree. You edit your opinions before you share them. You change your plans before they even know about them. You solve their problems before they become problems. You think you're being considerate, but here's what's actually happening. You've internalized their control system. You don't need them to manage your behavior anymore because you've learned to manage it for them. This works because all the previous conditioning has taught your brain to predict their reactions and avoid triggering negative responses. You've become so good at reading their patterns that you adjust yourself preemptively. The self-censorship feels like your choice because technically it is. But it's a choice made by a mind that's been systematically trained to prioritize their comfort over your authenticity. Here's what this looks like. David automatically considers how his girlfriend will react before making any decision. He doesn't invite certain friends over because she doesn't like them. He doesn't share opinions that might upset her. He doesn't pursue interests she finds boring. He thinks he's being a good partner, but he's actually been conditioned to erase parts of himself to maintain her approval. Step back and look at the full system. This isn't random behavior, it's a progression. First, they train you to seek their approval through reward withdrawal. Then they train you to avoid their disapproval through emotional punishment. They keep you hooked with intermittent validation. They gradually normalize disrespect until your standards drop. Finally, you start controlling yourself for them. Each stage builds on the last. Each one makes the next one more effective. And by the end, you don't need them to control you anymore because you've learned to control yourself for them. You don't notice this while it's happening because conditioning works below conscious awareness. Your brain is just trying to maintain relationships and avoid conflict. But here's what changes everything. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You'll start noticing how your behavior changes around certain people, how you edit yourself, how you predict their reactions, how you've learned to manage their emotions by managing yourself. The conditioning only works when you don't know it's happening. Awareness breaks the system. These videos take hours of research into psychology, behavioral patterns, and real-world manipulation dynamics. If you want to support that work and help me keep making these deep breakdowns, the Buy Me a Coffee link is below. If this feels familiar, you're not imagining it, and it's not your fault. But it is your responsibility to recognize it. It always starts the same way, with behaviors that look like kindness. That's why most people miss it completely. That's exactly what I broke down in my previous videos. 5 hidden manipulation tactics people use behind kindness, and 5 things you think are kindness, but they're actually making you a target. Watch those next because once you understand how the conditioning starts, you'll never fall for it again.